Hello, everyone. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we gather today. I'm on the lands of the Yugambeh people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. My name is Nicole Walker, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. A few quick housekeeping notes before I introduce our guest speaker. Today's session is being recorded, and we will share a recording with you probably about a week after today's session. We're also joined by a live captioner, and you can access those captions through the link in the Q&A. And on the Q&A, please feel free to submit questions throughout the session, and we will do our best to work through those at the end of the session. And so our speaker today is Captain Adrian Young. Adrian has built an exceptional career at the intersection of operational leadership, safety, and decision-making in high-pressure environments. With more than 35 years across Australasia, the United States, and Europe, he has held senior executive roles within the Qantas Group, including acting Chief Operating Officer and Chief Pilot. Currently, Adrian is Head of Network Safety at Qantas and leads the Qantas Group Safety Academy. He is also a Griffith alumnus, having completed a graduate certificate in Aviation Management in 2002. And he brings together real-world operational leadership with academic insight in management, risk, and safety systems. So really can't wait to hear from him today. He's going to share practical insights into how experienced leaders assess uncertainty, prioritise risk, apply structured thinking, and communicate clearly when the stakes are high. So please join with me in welcoming Adrian. I'm just going to bring him onto the screen now. Excellent. You're there and live, Adrian?
I am, Nicole.
Excellent. I'm going to hand over to you, and I'll be back later for the Q&A.
Thanks, Nicole. Much appreciated. And very good morning, good afternoon, everybody. As Nicole alluded to, my role, I've been attached to aviation for 36 years now. And in that 36 years, I've also been attached to Griffith University in some capacity for about 30 of those years. So it's been a significant journey, and it's obviously a privilege to be able to give back and also share my learnings to the alumni. So it's an honour and a privilege to be here today to talk about it. So I'm going to actually ask the team to bring up the PowerPoint presentation I've got, which is entitled From 38,000 Feet to the Boardroom. The intent of today's discussion really is around providing you some insights as an airline pilot, or just generally as a pilot, what we use in terms of decision-making and decision-making frameworks, and how you can actually apply that to the boardroom. I've been very fortunate through my career where I've been able to effectively operationalize my framework models that I use in the flight deck at 38,000 feet, and then bring that into leadership roles, into decision-making, and ensuring that the best outcome is being done for not only the business, but also in a time-critical manner. So I'll go to the first slide, if I could, please. So I want to start with a statement which really sums up aviation to an extent, for those who don't necessarily know aviation, which is made up of thousands of hours of sheer boredom, followed by seconds of sheer terror. That last statement, followed by seconds of sheer terror, is really around the decision-making that we actually have to make. And as a captain, regardless of whether you're flying what I fly, which is the Airbus, through to a two-seat trainer, right? The captain, the pilot in command, as they more commonly referred to it, in effect, is legally obligated, right, to ensure the safety of flight for everybody on board that aircraft. So ultimately, the captain has the lives of everybody in their hands. It's a legal obligation. So therefore, decisions that they make will be subject to legal scrutiny. That is the reason why a lot of pilots, we effectively have to make decisions in a very high pressure, high stress, high risk environment, but we have to have a framework under which we make those decisions. Because if we make the wrong decision, it may implicate a legal aspect. It could also implicate impact on our passengers, our customers, our people, our brand, and our business. So in essence, as a pilot, right, throughout my career, we are obligated to effectively demonstrate that decision making. We practice it 4 times a year. We're probably one of the only industries around where, as a pilot, demonstrating that decision making, you are throwing scenarios in that simulator 4 times a year, and you have to solve it, right? And in essence, where our license and our job is effectively on the line when we do those simulator sessions, as I said, 4 times a year, every 3 months, every 6 months, depending upon where you are. So in essence, the more practice you get, the better easier it becomes but more importantly, it's really around ensuring you've got a good framework. So with that in mind, if a framework can work at 38,000 feet with seconds to act, effectively it can act and it can work anywhere in any industry. So if I go to the next slide, I'd like to introduce you to 2 frameworks that we use. And both of these frameworks I've actually applied into my leadership career. And the first one is really around known as GRADE. Some people may or may not have heard of GRADE, but as it says there, this is around strategic decision making. All right. And effectively, it's when you've got benefit of time, data, and consultation. So if I just go through it in detail, there's a couple of steps. The first one for G is gather. R is review, A is analyze, D is decide, and E is evaluate. So let's go into detail of each of these elements. So the first step is around gathering all the relevant information. So for example, if I'm in a leadership or a management meeting and we've got to make a decision, right, and the team are turning to me to make a decision, I'm going to gather all the information first and foremost. So in other words, getting the input from the team, all right? That's the most important bit. Do we have reports? More importantly, are there risks associated with it? In other words, gather all the data points to be able to understand what's going on here. The most important thing, which is don't rush past this step, right? Gather as much information as you possibly can, all right? Don't, incomplete information leads to flawed decisions. That's probably the key piece. The next one we go into is review, and we talk about examining critically. So in other words, what is fact? What is an assumption, right? But also, if people are putting on the table data, challenge that data, right? Seek, as it says there, seek disconfirming evidence, right? So this is where I see most leaders fall short. They simply accept what's on the table in front of them. They haven't spent much time to review it, and they make a decision, sometimes wrongly, right? Or in error based on what they think is actually there. The next step is to analyze it. Assess options against objectives, risks and consequences. So in other words, we've now gathered it, we've now reviewed it. Let's analyze it in a little bit of detail, right? Which is, let's play out some scenarios here. What's the cost benefit to the business, to the team? And more importantly, is there any regulatory implications, any legal aspects we've got to actually consider at this point in time? All right. So in other words, it's starting to analyze and it's also starting to effectively look downstream or a bit further on. What are the implications based on this proposed decision? The next step, is decide. So based on the first 3, you're now in a position to make a decision. Commit to a course of action with clarity and conviction, as it says, right? Which is effectively make that decision, give that clear direction to the team, and effectively own the decision, right? In other words, as a leader, as a captain, I have to make a decision. The buck stops with me. As a result, that decision rests solely and entirely on my shoulders. But as a crew, the crew have had their input, right? To be able to provide me as much information. I've reviewed it. I've analysed it in consultation with them. Now we make the decision and we move on from there. Then we move to the last stage, which is evaluate. So in other words, we've made the decision. We've now executed on that decision, whatever it may be. We review the outcomes, refine it, and did the decision deliver as planned, right? So it's simply a post-implementation review, lessons learned, and what could we have done differently, better for next time? The most important thing here around using grade, because as I said, we can use grade on the flight deck, but also grade is a really good tool to be able to apply um, in management, in leading scenarios that you may face in your industry. All right, things like organizational restructures, strategic risk decisions, regulatory submissions, and obviously long-term planning. So if I move to the next model, and this is what we effectively use today in the flight deck. And again, I can use this in the um, leadership and the management roles, which is known as a DUDA. Okay. Um, there is another letter here, and I'll explain that in a moment. But this is around operational decision making. So, in other words, the clock's ticking, right? This is really around. It's actually an aviation-born framework for crisis. So, for example, we're faced with a scenario, whatever that scenario may be on the flight deck, and as a result, we now need to action this decision-making framework to make a decision in a very timely manner, but appropriate to the situation that we're dealing with. So, as it says there, the first D stands for diagnose. We then look at options. We'll come to that in a moment. Then we decide, we assign, and we review. Now, the one fundamental difference between grade and DUDA is a circular piece. It is not a straight line. So what that effectively means is once you get to the review piece, you go back to the beginning, which is, okay, do we need to re-diagnose? What are review our options again, make another decision, assign, review, and we continuously do this. Now, I mentioned when I started on this journey about DUDA, there is another letter that starts at the front of it, which we apply in the flight deck, right? And that is F, right? Which stands for fly, right? The first and most important bit is who's actually flying the aircraft, right? So in essence, F stands for who's in control at that point in time when the system's failure has occurred. Now we apply this operational decision framework. In a leadership or a management role, the first one is, okay, the way I would actually say is sometimes people apply a T at the front, right? Which is, what's my time? What's my time frame? So therefore, I've walked into a room, I've been hit with this problem, got the team there. Right. First question is, how soon do we have to make this decision? Right. So I now know the clock's ticking. I can now implement this framework and away it goes from there. So in more detail, diagnose. Right. Diagnose is really about clarifying, right, the issue. In other words, understanding the root cause. Okay. So for example, we might have had a failure on an engine. The first and foremost is confirm which engine has actually failed. Right? Never rush in. Never. The most important thing that I got taught very early on in my career, which is before I make any decision, is effectively putting the hands underneath my butt, looking at the problem that I've got in front of me, and then making a decision based on the facts in front of me. So diagnose the problem first. Options. What are my options at this point in time? Generate all potential courses of action. Engaging with the team, right? And that means the most junior cabin crew member. That might also mean picking up the radio to my engineering team, my ground ops team. Could be anything, anyone, right? So in the management and the leadership scenario, what I normally do is I usually turn to my most junior person in the room and go, okay, I want your opinion. I value your opinion. Give me what your view is on this. And it's getting everyone's options and putting it into the melting pot. In the flight deck, for example, do I need to land immediately? Can I go into a holding pattern, just to give myself a little bit of time to sort it out? Do I need to divert, right? Or do I need to continue on to the port that I'm actually planning or the destination that I'm planning to get to? Now that I've diagnosed the problem, I've got all the options in front of me, we make the decision, right? We select the best option by evaluating risk and benefit. So in other words, what's the risks that I'm looking at? What's the actual benefits by doing option A, B, or C? Now, more importantly, right, with decide, when you're dealing with complex scenarios, right, you're often seeking the least worst outcome, right? So, and the problem that most leaders get themselves into, right, and I see it time and time again, with sometimes even in pilots, which is they effectively are not prepared to make a decision because what they're trying to achieve, right, is a perfect solution. The reality is there is no perfect solution, right? You have to make a decision based on the best information that is in front of you in that timely manner, because as I started at the beginning, in the flight deck, lives are in my hands. Versus in the office, it might be a critical decision because there is something going on that has to be executed on, right? Are you going to get it right? Sadly, no. You're going to make mistakes. That's a reality. But you've got to make the best decision based on what you know at that point in time. Can you refine it? The answer is yes, because this model actually allows you to be able to go back and refine it, slightly change it, and repoint it in the direction that you want it. The next one is then I start to delegate tasks, right? No one, whether you're the greatest leader in the world, executes alone, right? So, in other words, the decision's been made. We're going down this pathway. I start out assigning the tasks for what people are doing and who's doing what. As a captain on the aircraft, people perceive that the captain lands the aircraft. That's a false belief, all right? The captain's there to have oversight. The leader is there to have oversight and ensure that his team or her team can actually execute on it. So the thing I do most is I say to the first officer, right, you're flying the aircraft. I want you to fly it. I'll manage the circumstance with everyone around me. That's the first assignment I make. Then I engage with my cabin crew. What's their roles? How do they actually start to help me solve this problem that we're dealing with? Right? In a leadership circumstance, again, I'm picking up on people's strengths. I know my team. As a result, I'm now assigning tasks to the team to be able to go away and execute on the decision that we've actually made together. And then finally, it's around review. So in other words, we come back very quickly, continuously evaluate, right? In other words, is there more information that's coming in that we now need to pivot and re-diagnose the problem that we've got, and then be able to, again, look at our options, decide, assign, review. And this is a continuous cycle that we go through, right? Now, the most important thing that if you take away anything is that key statement, the last sentence there, the best decision makers know when to go back to the start. Now, how do you know when to go back to the start? Effectively, at this point in time, you can start that assign, start the review, and step back and take a deep breath, look at the scenario again and go, okay, I'm going back to the problem. Has the problem changed? No, it hasn't. Are the options working? Yes or no, right? Is the decision being executed on? Is it delivering what I expected it to deliver? Do I need to reassign, right, or review my assigned tasks to people, right? And then finally, come back to the review. So they are two models that I can actually use in the flight deck, but I can also bring into the boardroom. Now, people generally ask me a question, which is, how does this actually apply in the real world? All right. Particularly in the boardroom, in the leadership meeting area. So can I go to the next slide, please? The one thing I'll say to everybody is you've got to create decision windows, right? Short term, medium, and long term. And it really depends on the problem statement that's in front of you, right? Because as it says there, elite decision makers visualize two, three, 4 steps ahead and ask, what if? Now, that comes with experience. I'm probably a person that I've been fortunate in the fact that I've got the flight deck experience, but also now bringing it into my management scenarios. I'm actually planning when I'm looking at problems, 2 to 3, 4 steps ahead and going, okay, what's that windows look like? So my advice to everybody would be think through a short-term window. What happens in the short term? What happens in the medium? And what happens in the long term? Now, a couple of examples there. So in the short term, what's going to happen the next hour if I make this decision versus next day? Medium term, hypothetically, you can change again depending upon the problem that you're dealing with, right? Which is what's going to happen in the next 24 hours with this decision versus I make this decision now, what happens in the next week? And I'll give some examples in a moment as to how this can actually really apply in the real world. And then the final piece is the long term, okay, which is I'm making this decision now. What's potential in the next 7 days versus the next month for the business? So on the flight deck, as an example, I have to think through, well, if I divert to this airport, what happens to the passengers, crew legality? And what that means is that crew are specified certain hours, be it through their work contract or be it through the legislation. Do we have engineering support for the problem that I'm dealing with? And then what's the impact to the next day's schedule? Right. So these are the scenarios I've actually got to play out in my head very quickly as part of the options, part of the analyze for the grade model. And then I've got to start blending this all together to go, okay, I've got to make a decision now. In the boardroom, if I approve this action today, what are the second and third order consequences across the business this week? So if this decision happens today, what's going to happen in the next 24 hours to the business versus the next 7 days, next month, or even the quarter? So my advice to everybody is when you're in a high pressure environment and decisions have to be made, structure your thinking in windows. All right. It supports and prevents tunnel vision, right? And forces you to consider downstream consequences. I go to the next slide, please. Right. And I now want to actually take this into an environment where putting this into a real world practical scenario. Okay. I'll come back to flight deck events in a moment, but crisis management, for those that do any form of crisis management around the place, and sometimes industries do go into crisis. Right? And this is around managing operational continuity during different scenarios. So, for example, industrial action, right? RAID is great for strategic planning, and I'll talk to you about that in a moment. And then DUDA, whereas DUDA is for real-time decisions and decision windows to anticipate escalation. So I'll give you a really good example. If I go back about 3 years ago, we were forced into a scenario across the Qantas Group where effectively one of our pilot groups decided to take industrial action. They had voted upon that industrial action. There's 26 forms of industrial action. The 26th form of industrial action was to take a 24-hour work stoppage. Generally speaking, in the Australian market, when people take industrial action, they generally start to ramp it up slowly and gradually. Unfortunately, this pilot group went straight to a 24-hour work stoppage, which is fine. They're entitled to do it. They voted on it. However, the business needed to respond to it. At the time, I had my boss came to me and said, right, we're pulling you out. We need you to manage this. Now, from the time notification came in to the time the stop work occurred, we had 72 hours to prepare. And the first step in my mind was basically, okay, gather how much information, in other words, who could actually fly, who's not flying, what does this mean to the fleet of aircraft that we've got across the Qantas Group? How do we actually start to provide services to our customers, right? So effectively, for the next 72 hours, I effectively had to work through on a consistent basis a grade model, right? And I can tell you when I started to when we finished at the 72-hour mark, the decisions we started at the beginning had changed dramatically by the time we got to the end. But we had to decide very early on, and one of the key decisions we made was what are the key principles under which we are going to manage this crisis, right? So in other words, those key principles went back to the windows I was talking about earlier. In other words, if this lasts for 24 hours, could they go another 24 hours? Could they go for another week? And the irony in the situation was that they went for a month. right? So effectively, I had to actually plan to the point where if the crew were not available, what would it mean to the operation? So in essence, those models came into real world experience and real world life, sharing it, bringing together all the stakeholders, gathering all the information, reviewing it, analyzing it, deciding, and effectively we put checkpoints in to we're talking about evaluate or review, depending upon which model you use. We were doing those reviews and evaluations every 4 hours during that crisis. I then go to the next element, which is environmental events. And these effectively are, I'll call it acts of God, which are things like volcanic ash, cyclones, pandemic responses, as an example. Rapidly evolving situations requiring continuous reassessment. Right? The model loops, the windows shift. And that's the critical piece. Unfortunately, none of us have a hotline to God to understand at what point a cyclone is going to hit the coast in Australia. Right, and they do change, and they change rapidly. Volcanic ash is exactly the same, and obviously we've all been through the pandemic elements, but pandemic responses, when you're dealing with uncertainty, you've got to make the best decision based on the facts that are in front of you at that point in time. Again, I want to give an absolute honest and a learning experience that I had with cyclones. Um, I've managed enough responses to cyclones to understand how cyclones start to move around the place, but they do change occasionally. And we had a scenario where we've been planning the evacuation of one of our bases, moved the aircraft out of there, moved our people out of there to safety. So in other words, that decision was made appropriately based on the facts at that point in time. The information we'd been given on the cyclone was that the cyclone was going to hit to the north of that base, about approximately 100 nautical miles to the north. And in doing so, we moved the aircraft to the south. So further south, out of harm's way. We thought it was the right decision, right? However, at about 1 o'clock in the morning, when it was meant to be uh, almost crossing the coast, I got a phone call from our ops centre to say it has changed direction, and it is actually going south now, directly towards the place where we'd actually put the aircraft. So at 1 o'clock in the morning, we couldn't wake up crew to get aircraft out. I had to make a decision at that point in time, which simply said, okay, my hands were forced. We were into a corner. And the reality was, I said, okay, I had to make sure that the assets were safe, the people were safe, and no one was going to get impacted, which everyone was, which was great. However, it meant that our aircraft were now grounded in that port for the next 12 hours as a result of the cyclone passing over that area. So what did I learn from that? I think there's a couple of things I learned personally from that, which was I made the decision based on the best information at that point in time. Did I get it right? No, I did not. It was an act of God that changed it, right? But the reality was I probably would have gone a little bit more conservative in the equation, which was moving even further south or further away from harm's way. The one thing I'll say to everybody here online, which is you won't always get it right. No one does. Right. That's the reality. Whilst humans are interfacing with systems and machines, errors will occur. But the most important thing, which I emphasize to everyone that I mentor and teach around decision making, right, which is you're going to have to learn quickly and reapply the model to pivot your decision making as quickly as you possibly can. Right. The last piece, which is a structured framework, gives you the confidence to change course. All right. So in other words, if you see things starting to change, get back to that framework straight away, reevaluate, re-diagnose, look at your options again and say, okay, my first decision was probably not appropriate. Now here's my new decision. We now pivot and we move. Right. And that's one of the keys to successes when you're in a high pressure environment and time is of a critical nature. I'll move to the next slide, please. Now, we all make decisions in life, in everything we do. Um, the one thing I'll say to everybody is you've got to be careful sometimes making decisions based on gut instinct or without structure. Right? Without structure, as it points out there, you will be subject to tunnel vision, right? You become fixated on one element while missing the bigger picture. Confirmation bias will kick in, right? Which is effectively, we've all got a bias of some description. And in effect, when you've made that decision without thinking through it, you've confirmed the bias that you've got. Task saturation, trying to do everything and achieving nothing well. So in other words, go back to what I said earlier in terms of the systematic approach, which is assigning tasks, right? But more importantly, you've got a team of people around you that are SMEs. They know that generally speaking, they know stuff better than you. So leverage them, use them to your advantage. And then finally, decision paralysis, all right? And this is a really interesting one for a lot of people, all right, which is the inability to make decision, or they're waiting for more information to be able to make that decision, right? In other words, sometimes people get overwhelmed by the complexity and are unable to commit. The reality is it's better to make a decision than to not make a decision at all. So what I say to a lot of people is then let's take it and the best approach, which is the systematic approach. The systematic approach, the framework that I've shown you all, drives consistency. So you've got repeatable outcomes regardless of the stress levels. Now, my team, and you do see in high pressure environments, the best and the worst of people. And so therefore, when you've given people frameworks, when you're working within a framework, right, your stress level comes down because you're systematically going through it step by step. Whereas without structure, it's headless chooks running around trying to sort out how to actually solve the problem. So consistency is one of the key elements around a systematic approach. Accountability, a clear rationale for every decision made. So in other words, you've gathered everyone's information, and therefore as a result, everyone's had that input. But then when the decision is made, it's based on a clear understanding of who is actually making that decision. Finally, adaptability, a framework to pivot when conditions change. As I keep saying, that's the beauty of the framework. And confidence, which is around trusting the process, even when the answer isn't obvious. All right. So just to close this out, as a captain, all right, I'm started at the beginning, which is decision making is my legal obligation. I've got no way to actually say it's not me, it's someone else's. Well, I don't have that discretion at all. Right. That same rigor can be applied to business leadership. All right. And it separates reactive management from deliberate, defensible leadership. If I go to the last slide, please. If I can leave you with some takeaways for today's discussion, which is consider using grade for strategic decisions where time and data are available. All right. Grade, as I mentioned, stands for gather, review, analyze, decide, and evaluate. You can use DUDA, right, for time critical, high pressure decisions. So you diagnose it, options, decide, assign, review. And remember, it's a loop, not a straight line. Consider visualizing ahead, apply decision windows, short, medium, long term, to anticipate consequences before you commit based on the problem that you've got in front of you. Accept imperfection. You will not always get it right. Learn quickly, pivot decisively, and reapply the model. Be systematic always. Under pressure, structure is going to be your greatest asset. Without it, errors are inevitable. Now, the framework keeps our aircraft safe at 38,000 feet. They're the same frameworks that drive sound decisions in the boardroom. The altitude changes, but most importantly, the discipline doesn't. So on that note, I'd like to thank the team for the opportunity to speak today, and I'm more than happy to take any questions on that discussion.
Thanks. Thanks, Adrian. That was excellent. Really, really interesting session. We've got some questions in here. We've got a lighthearted, I think it's intended to be lighthearted one, an off-topic one to start with, which is, were these strategies used when seeing UFOs, and have you had any sightings?
Look, the answer to the second question, which is, have I seen any UFOs? No, I've never seen UFOs. So short answer is no. Okay.
Okay, that's right. Sorry, let me get back down. The next one was around when you were talking to us through Duda, you mentioned asking the most junior person first. Could you please explain why you start there?
Generally speaking, look, it's probably an ethos that I have. The most junior person has probably come in with the most that they've just done their degree or they've just done their qualifications. So therefore, they are fresh in the knowledge of current information, so to speak. So therefore, I actually tap into their mindset, and they may not have all the answers at that point in time based on experience, but it's about their thinking, and it's tapping into their knowledge first and foremost, just to see is there something there that I'm missing, right? In terms of the latest thinking that may be out there in the industry.
Awesome. Thank you. The next question is, how is AI influencing decision making in aviation? How should leaders balance data-driven insights with human judgment?
Yep, great. That's a great question. AI is something that I think most industries are challenged with. Aviation more so. To me, it's an enabler. All right. I use it as an enabler in decision making. All right. In other words, and we're actually in the midst, particularly across the Qantas Group at the moment, from a crisis management perspective, as to how we bring AI into that decision making process. So, in other words, humans can do so much with experience. AI can give some other insights, which we do pull in and go, okay, have we thought about A, B, C, D? No, we haven't. All right. So it's actually a blended model. Is probably the best way of putting it, Nicole, to answer this question. We're approaching a blended model, whereas particularly in decision making, that's definitely there. Having said that, though, there are other aspects of the industry where AI can give us a lot more insights than any human input, which is awesome. That information we're actually then leveraging to be able to make decisions. So, for example, on-time performance for some of the aircraft that we've got. How do we turn the aircraft faster, quicker? So, in other words, it's looking at from a machine learning, from a algorithmic perspective, looking at areas where we can improve the turn. So, therefore, based on that information, we're making modifications to the way we do our turns. And then again, using the model, where made the decision to make some changes. Then we review it, and as a result, has it actually materialized? Yes or no? So, in essence, AI is that enabler to actually help us without. And as I said, I'm an advocate for AI, particularly to support decisions because it does give you a lot of insight.
Thank you. The next question, and there's a lot of questions, is what importance do you place on physical and mental health for leaders?
Great question. I think the most important thing is from a physical and mental health perspective is ensuring two aspects to it. Obviously, for leaders, um, actually, I'll step back a step. I think I'll go down the mental health piece first. In everything we do, everything has to be psychologically safe, right? But also psychosocial safe as well. Okay. So, in other words, it comes back to what I said earlier, which is by using these frameworks, everybody knows the rules of engagement. Everybody knows how we do it. And I spoke earlier about by using frameworks, it actually reduces stress. By reducing stress, that actually decreases people's or supports people's mental health in the environment, particularly when you're in a high pressure environment, right? And as a captain, you actually have to be very calm under pressure, right?
Yep.
You cannot react. You have to create an environment where people's mental health can actually not be impacted. From a physicality perspective, we certainly encourage everyone to be physically fit. As we say, as pilots, we have medicals and we have to meet certain physical criteria. But in the leadership and in the boardroom, right, the expectation is, and we know this, which is healthy lives equals better decisions. right? So the more you support your people, both in the physical and the mental health circumstance, you're going to get better outputs from them in the workplace.
Thank you. What is your favorite flying or pilot movie?
Oh, I love this. It's a great question. Look, I would have to say at the moment, I'd say, yeah, Top Gun Maverick. I'll leave it at that. Okay.
Yep, very good. Using the decision windows framework, can you give us an example of how that can be used when planning around the current fuel supply disruption? And perhaps
Yeah.
is that the right framework to use? Yeah.
Yeah. No, look, it's a great one because ironically, when the fuel crisis occurred, we stood up our crisis management team, which I was party to. And ironically, we actually started with the grade model, which was gather all the facts. In other words, first and foremost, um, what does this mean to the fuel situation in Australia? Not just the main ports, but also our regional ports, our international ports of operation. What does that all mean? We then reviewed all that information, right, and then also analysed it to go, well, okay, um, for the next period of time, do we need to make changes to our network's schedule, right, to be able to ensure that we've got sufficient fuel to ensure that the aircraft can operate to those ports? Decide the first decision we made based on the first piece, which was we had sufficient fuel in the system to be able to continue, and we continued. We then went into the review, into the evaluate mode to see, well, okay, how does this work? We then got more information from government. Obviously, supply was starting to be impacted, and we made changes to the network. So it was a continuous model as we went through it. More importantly, I think the other aspect to it was we needed to understand, and I'm based in Perth. One of our regional aspects of WA was that we could start to see the trucks getting impacted. So we had to play scenarios out, which was the fuel at the outputs will only last so long, but then what's the fuel look like to get in there? So therefore, you're talking diesel trucks. Diesel was expensive. Diesel wasn't coming to Australia, so we had to play that scenario out. So we going back to my windows that we look at. The short term was the next week that we planned on. The medium term was the next month, and effectively the long term was beyond a month. The next 3 months, what does that look like? So we had to play those scenarios out and the what ifs, and to help us with our decisions as we went through it.
Great. Thank you. The next question was, what does a standard week look like for you? Do you have a standard week, perhaps?
Look, I think a standard week for me is I've taken on this office role as the head of safety for one of the airlines. It's effectively Monday to Friday, but I'm on call 24/7 because from a safety perspective, I'm not just dealing with operational safety, I'm dealing with people safety. And so therefore, I've got a lot of responsibility on my shoulders. And in terms of a typical week for me, um, I every morning I have a management and leadership meeting with my safety team across the organisation, and then I also have a executive team meeting with the executives of the airline. And then once a week, I also meet with my counterparts at a group level, right, to determine what's going on across the group and what do we need to do collaboratively to ensure that safety is being upheld across the organisation. So I'd probably say last week wasn't an ordinary week, and then when you add, if you have incidents on top of that, the week changes dramatically. So, no, I have a saying which is 24 hours is a long time in aviation because it's such a dynamic industry and it changes so rapidly.
This next question has got a few questions in it, so I'll just read it all out to you. Have you observed simulated decision-making role play in the corporate environment where best, second best, etc. decisions can be observed and learnings coached? If yes, are there measures of before simulation versus after simulation for the quality of decision improving? And do decisions like the work stoppage get simulated?
Yes. So the answer to that question is yes, we do. One thing that we do and I've actually just run the last, I'll call it simulation or training process for our teams, for our leadership teams. which is we play out a scenario and effectively put them under pressure to deal with a certain problem, right? And so as a result, we have a structure, we have processes, we have procedures under which they have to make decisions. So they have to prepare. They don't know what the problem is. We get them in the room and they effectively have 20 minutes from this time that I'll call it the text message is issued to the time that they've got to come out with a decision. And so as a result, running that scenario just recently with some of our junior leaders, it was a bit of an eye opener for many of them, right? But at least we're upskilling them to get them more and more comfortable with making decisions. So after that simulation, we then sit back and go, okay, what worked? What didn't work? What do we need to improve on? Where are the areas that we need to support people in their development?
Awesome. Thank you. The next question is, how do you believe your frameworks and strategies would be best applied in the world of sports coaching and people management?
Okay. Sports coaching and people management. Okay. I'll talk to people management first before I go to sports coaching in a sec. But people management, so it, again, the frameworks, regardless of the circumstance. So, for example, with people management, someone decides to either play silly buggers in the workplace, okay, um, or doesn't create a safe environment or breaches a policy or whatever the case might be. So, in other words, the first piece I'll use grade. So, gather the facts. Did the individual? What do we know from witness statements? What do we know from information? Review it, analyze it. Right. In other words, review the information that's been given to you, analyze it in terms of in the context of is it legitimate or not, and then decide on the action that you're going to take, and then reevaluate it in that process. Now, people management as an example, you can also look at it from the perspective of okay, from a strategic perspective. What's the people strategy for the next 12 months, right? Getting everyone in the room, right? So diagnose, for example, engagement scores, right? What is your engagement survey actually telling you, right? What are our options at that point in time, right? Decide at that point, well, okay, let's look at options here. Assign tasks, who's going to do what in that strategy build, so to speak, and then review the whole scenario again on a quarterly, 6 monthly basis. So there's different ways to actually apply the model, right? But it can be applied in people management. Sports coaching, exactly the same scenario, right? So in other words, it could be from an individual perspective or a team perspective. So from a team perspective, I'll take again using grade from a strategic perspective. In other words, what's the aim of the team? The team wants to win the championship, right? So okay, gather the information around we want to achieve the championship. Guess what? Where's my weakest players? Where's my strongest players? Gather all this information about the playing team, right? The players and how they interact as a team, right? Review it, analyze it, right? In other words, have I got the best players on the team? Do I need to actually do something different here? Decide, evaluate, and guess what? You're back into a continuous cycle, and you continue to do that to go forward.
Great. The next question is, are there any methods you would employ to aid in the prevention of choice paralysis in the options phase of DUDA?
Yep. Yeah. Look, there's probably one thing I'd say is that you people will work out pretty quickly. You'll go into circular arguments, right? Where effectively you've started at a point for ready for a decision, and then it's challenged, and effectively you're coming back to that same point. Um, the way I would suggest to everybody to think about it is effectively give yourself a time frame. So is it 2 minutes, 5 minutes to make that decision, right? And listen to everyone's views. Make a decision at that point in time. Whatever that decision is, make it. The other aspect to it is also keep in the back of your mind, right, that framework, the window framework that I mentioned earlier, which is, okay, if I make this decision, do I need to just slightly refine it based on short, medium, or long term, right? And just make that decision at that point in time, right? People have the experience, people have to trust themselves, right? And people have to back themselves, right? I have a saying with my team and every team I've ever led, which is ask for forgiveness, not for permission. Right. In other words, don't make a decision, right? Whether it's right or wrong, just make it, because I'd rather you make a decision than come and ask me to make the decision for you.
Great advice. The next question is, how do you ensure psychological safety for junior members involved in decision making when using these frameworks?
Yep. Generally speaking, the junior members, right, will be empowered to make those decisions, right? Most importantly, it's about, from a psychological safety perspective, is giving them the empowerment to speak up and challenge, right? And that's one of the reasons why I always start with the most junior person first, right? Because what I don't want to do is start with the traditional loudest person in the room, right, or the most opinionated person in the room, right? It's actually start with them first, give them the power to actually feel that they can actually have a voice and they can actually say it, right? When I'm in the chair, for example, when I'm managing a circumstance and I'm watching the team starting to make a decision, the most junior person will then, um, if he or she is quiet, I'll actually say to them, I would welcome your input. What do you think? Right. So it's a bit of an open question, right? There's no right or wrong answer, right? And we set down rules of engagement from the beginning. As I said, there's no right or wrong answer here. Every voice is valued, regardless of most junior to the most senior person in the room. So from a psychological safety perspective, right, by setting those ground rules early, everyone can actually contribute. And most importantly, I also then, as a senior leader, I also need to take an interest in that individual to ensure that I know their background and tap into their experience profile. Now, as a junior leader, right, it's incumbent upon you, because you're bringing a skill set to the table, which some of the older people don't necessarily have, right? They might have the experience, great. They might, but remembering that experience may not be fit for purpose to solve this problem, whereas you've got that experience. So it's feeling comfortable, confident to be able to say, look, um, I've got an opinion or I've got a view. Have we considered A, B, and C?
Great advice. Again, thank you. The next question is around how might you go about trying to gather all the information, either D and Duda or G and grade, if it's not on all one site, e.g. across environments or teams?
Okay. Welcome to the Qantas Group. When you're dealing with multiple teams, when you're dealing with multiple data points, data sources is probably the best way of putting it. You've got to be able to ensure that you've got the right people and the right stakeholders in the room when you're going through that. So in other words, there will come a time when you're in a team environment, you've got to make some decisions. You do need to lean in on other teams, right? So you'll need to pick up the phone, ask questions, and effectively get another person's opinion in that equation, right? Regardless of the circumstance. So um, gather or diagnose, doesn't matter which way, it's about ensuring you've got the right stakeholders in the room.
The next question says, I've learnt a lot from you. Thank you so much. How to take the risk when taking a decision in the most adversity? Is it better not to take any decision and let fate to decide it?
Look, short answer to your question is um, sometimes you have to make a decision, but don't let fate ever decide for you. It's probably the best way of putting it. Because by making this decision, you've got control over the circumstance, right? And it's better to control it than to let fate, because fate could actually take it in a different pathway, and it's not where you want to end up.
So next question, a bit to it, so I'll read it. With taking a pilot's framework into a boardroom, an crew is very close to the situation. Authority and responsibility sit together and they make the decisions. How do you reconcile that with a boardroom or leadership team where often a board wants to make or manage decisions but are much further from the situation? Not convinced that a board is a pilot with managers or other parts of the organisation acting as instrument panels.
It's a fair question and a fair comment. I would say that at the end of the day, from a boardroom perspective, right, the board actually has legal obligations, right, particularly if they're a publicly listed company, right, to ASX. So they've got a legal responsibility not just to the ASX and the government from that perspective, but also to their shareholders, right? So you flip it the other way, which is a pilot, yes, they're looking at instruments, but the instruments are telling them what's going on with the circumstance. As an example, a board is looking at a balanced scorecard or KPIs, right, in terms of the performance of the business. Guess what? It's exactly the same thing, right? In other words, the instruments of the KPIs in terms of the performance of the aircraft, KPIs in the boardroom, be it dollars, customer, production times, all of that is exactly the same, right? So the same principle applies in the boardroom as it would in the flight deck. So the board has a legal obligation. The chairman of the board can be legally prosecuted for various things. So guess what? The chairman is the captain of the board. So in essence, the same principle applies regardless of flight deck board. Those models will actually help them in that process.
Right. Probably only got time for, I think, probably one more question. Oftentimes new leaders have a tendency to hold back on decision making. How do you push new pilots to make decisions without second guessing themselves?
Yep. Great. That's a great question. The advice I'd give to everyone is it's actually when I'm doing training, particularly in the simulator, for example, and a decision's not being made, right, I will then start to throw different scenarios, which starts to load the individual up a little bit, which effectively forces their hand to make the decision, or forces their hand to make a decision, I should say, right? So what that means is that with junior leaders that are fearful of making the decision, I think you've got to unpack the first question, which is, well, why are they so fearful? Is it confidence? Is it capability? If it's confidence, that's an easy one to fix. If it's capability, then it's about developing and supporting them. All right. Mentoring is a really good example. All right. So in other words, sometimes, and again, you've got to empower them, right? Which is ask for forgiveness, not for permission, right? In other words, make the decision, regardless of what the outcome is, get them to learn from it as quickly as possible, right? The faster you learn, the better you become as a decision maker in that process.
Thank you. We're going to start wrapping up now, and I can see there's a question there about the Safety Academy by Qantas. So I've just got a note that I'll read out, and then I might just put that question to you, Adrian, so you can answer it. So in a really fitting extension of today's conversation, Qantas has partnered with Griffith University and RMIT University to establish the Safety Academy by Qantas Group. The Academy offers a range of micro-credentials designed to upskill safety professionals and develop safety leaders in high-reliability organisations like mining, engineering, logistics and aviation. And key areas that the credentials focus on is safety culture and ethical safety leadership, risk management, data and safety intelligence, cybersecurity, and human safety factors, including sleep and fatigue management. Each micro-credential runs for 6 weeks and is designed to fit around professional schedules and can be studied online at your own pace. So we'll pop a link for that into the chat. But the question was, would we learn these things in the Safety Academy by Qantas modules? And if so, which one?
Okay. The answer to that question is there's a couple of modules. One is around crisis management, which is scheduled for later this year. And there's also other aspects. So I think it's safety systems thinking, I think by memory, and leadership is another one that's in there as well. So just as a bit of a plug for the Safety Academy, we're in the phase of building the next 4 micro credentials going through at the moment, and they'll be released in the next couple of weeks. And then the last 4 will be by the end of this year. So we'll have 12 micro credential courses available to industry or anyone that wants to do it. But exactly what I just outlined, those skill sets around decision making and bits and pieces are actually in the 3 courses that I've just named.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time today, Adrian. We've got really a lot of feedback in the chat as well. Thanking you for the valuable and informative sessions insights that you've shared with us in this session.